Thank you to everybody that has joined us this evening. I'm Julie, I'm with the Aravaipa Running, and I am so excited that we have this opportunity to meet with two people from Gnarly. We have them now on board as a sponsor, and we're going to have their nutrition available starting this weekend at Mesquite Canyon. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to hear from two experts in the field with Gnarly about their nutrition and how that can help you get to the finish line through the rest of our events this year. So without further ado, I want to introduce Shannon O Grady. Shannon has her PhD in nutritional physiology from the University of Utah. She is the Chief Operating and Product Officer at Gnarly Nutrition. And her focus is to create clean, natural, and effective supplements for an active lifestyle. She's also a mother of two, and she's a competitive athlete herself. And she's constantly looking for the crossroads between training and nutrition for insights on how to improve performance, reduce injury, and increase longevity. So thank you, Shannon, for being here.
Thanks, Julie.
And then we have Trevor Fuchs. Close, I hope. He's a plant-based.
Books with enough.
You got it. You got it.
He's a plant-based trail and ultra runner. He's based in Ogden, Utah. He's been vegan for over 10 years, which is incredibly impressive. And he considers his diet and running career to be mutually dependent. He enjoys racing many distances and any terrain, but his niche is in mountainous 100-mile distance. When he's not running around the foothills or trying to keep up with his 3 kids, you'll probably find him in the kitchen exploring one of the million ways to prepare a potato. Maybe you should send us some recipes. Oh yeah, and in 2020, he got first place at the Hurt 100 and set the new FKT on the White Rim Trail in Moab in 15 hours and 59 minutes. So thank you, Trevor, for also joining us this evening.
Yeah, of course.
So Shannon, if you want to go ahead and take it away, I think we have maybe 30 to 40 minutes of presentation with Shannon and Trevor, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A session. So go ahead and type any questions that you might have in the comment box. Raise your hand if you have a question. We might also kind of jump in with some of those if you see them as well, Shannon.
Yeah, awesome. That works great. Okay, I'm gonna try to share my screen here and hopefully goes well. Choose the correct thing. And okay, it's loading. And everybody, well, nobody can answer me, but hopefully you can see that. Trevor, can you see it? Okay, awesome. All right, thanks for that introduction. And we're super excited to be part of Aravaipa and be on the course this year with 2 products, hydration, Gnarly Hydrate, which is going to be at the marathon at distances less than a marathon, and Gnarly Fuel 2.0, which is a new product, which is going to be at distances of marathon or greater. So I'm going to talk about general run nutrition, and I'm going to kind of integrate some information about those products, and then also turn some time over to Trevor so he can tell you about his nutrition experience, what he does, and he's also used both of our products in races and in training, and so I think he can speak to those as well. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to be talking about energy systems and fuel use to start. I always have to inject some science into my talks because I think it's really important to understand why certain foods are the things to choose to fuel your runs. And then I'm going to get right to run nutrition and talk about what are some good things to consider when you're planning out your pre-run, your during run, and your post-run nutrition. So let's start by talking about energy systems and fuel use. So this is one of my favorite running quotes. Running is an eating contest on the go. I also had a really close friend who was a really successful 100-mile runner, and she always used to tell me that she considered them catered hikes, which I love. And it really speaks to the importance of dialing in your nutrition, both in terms of quantity and quality, in order to succeed, particularly in longer runs. So as I promised, we're going to start out with some science, and I'm going to talk about energy systems. So adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, may be a term you're familiar with. It may not, but it's the main energy currency in the body. In this rather crude diagram, ATP is the brown blob with the 3 orange circles attached to the end. So that brown blob is adenosine, and then those 3 circles are those 3 phosphate molecules. And the bonds between those molecules are really high energy. So when all 3 phosphates are bonded, you can think of it as a charged battery. And when we get the introduction of water, we get the release of one of those phosphates. And when that bond breaks, we get a release of energy. And that's why ATP is used for energy creation in our bodies. It's a cycle though, and so you can also add a phosphate group back on and once again store energy in ATP. And we use this kind of cyclical adding and removing of phosphates to create and store energy in all parts of our organ systems. So there are 3 main energy systems that our body uses to create energy via ATP. There's the creatine phosphate system, or creatine phosphagen system. They both are used kind of interchangeably. Oops. There we go. There's anaerobic glycolysis, which not primarily, only uses carbohydrates and occurs in the absence of oxygen. And then there's aerobic glycolysis, which can use either carbohydrates or fats and occurs in the presence of oxygen. So now let's talk about how these energy systems kind of feed into what macronutrient, either carbohydrates or fats, is used. So I love this graph because a lot of people think about these energy systems occurring back to back. So you are done with aerobic glycolysis and you get to a higher intensity and their body switches to anaerobic. But really, they're all kind of occurring at one time. And the proportion that one is used over the other is really dictated by intensity. Sorry, I'm moving our little faces around here so I make sure I don't miss anything. So on the bottom of this graph, in the x-axis, I have exercise intensity. So going from low intensity to high intensity. And on the y-axis, I have ATP needs. So how much that intensity requires in terms of energy production. And so as you increase in intensity, you need more ATP and you see more energy systems introduced. So at low intensities, we can meet most of our energetic demands via aerobic glycolysis or aerobic metabolism. As we're not able to keep up with those energy demands aerobically, so the oxygen we're bringing in, we're not able to bring in enough to only use aerobic metabolism. That's where you get your anaerobic threshold, and that's where anaerobic glycolysis kicks in. And then as ATP needs get really high, you see, things like the creatine phosphagen system, which produces energy really fast. So running is primarily an aerobic activity, although we do see some anaerobic metabolism as well. And because of that, we primarily use carbohydrates and fats as the substrate that creates this energy. So at very low intensities, fat can serve as the primary fuel, but as we increase intensity, even before the anaerobic threshold, we see carbohydrates become really important as well. And the proportion of fats versus carbohydrates can depend on a number of things. It can depend on the amount of fats or carbohydrates you have in your diet, and it can also depend on the kind of training that you've done. Things like long, slow distance training can increase your cardiovascular efficiency and can therefore help you burn fat at higher speeds. And that's why long, slow distance training is really important when you get into longer distances. So now let's talk about those macronutrients. So I'm going to start by talking about carbohydrates. So glycogen is the body's storage form of carbohydrates, and our bodies store enough glycogen to fuel about 60 to 90 minutes of exercise. And there are 2 major places that glycogen is stored: in the liver, and liver glycogen is really important for maintaining blood glucose, and then in the muscle. And muscle glycogen is what supplies that energy during muscle contraction. And carbohydrates are typically divided into two groups based on what is called glycemic index, or GI. Glycemic index is pretty much how quickly a carbohydrate is absorbed and how quickly it has an impact on our blood glucose. So in this graph, it shows a range of foods and where they fall in terms of glycemic index. So on the x-axis, we have time in hours, and on the y-axis, we have how quickly then those blood glucose levels are impacted. So the red curve are foods that are high in simple carbohydrates and have a high glycemic index. And the green curve are foods that are high in complex carbohydrates and have a low glycemic index. So, most people would look at that list of foods and be like, oh, well, they're Trevor's potatoes, they're falling in the simple carbohydrates, the high glycemic index, and a lot of those other foods might not be so good for me, and there are the low glycemic indexes full of, whole grains and vegetables, so I should eat more of the low glycemic index foods. And generally that's true, but high glycemic index foods play a really important role in fueling exercise of all types, but running in particular. And that's because high glycemic index foods are able to elevate blood sugar quickly. And because of that, they should be timed around efforts. So before and during exercise, because they keep blood glucose levels elevated. And then after exercise, because they're able to quickly replenish spent glycogen. Low glycemic index foods also play a really important role. And that's because they're really high in micronutrients and fiber. So they supply a lot of things like vitamins and minerals, which can have an impact on performance, but are also really just important for general health. They also are kind of that baseline for glycogen storage. So they help, keep our glycogen where it needs to be throughout the day before we exercise. So let's talk a little bit about fat as a fuel. I think this, I'm not going to get into keto diets or anything like that, but I'm just going to look at fat versus carbohydrates in terms of fueling aerobic exercise. So at 9 calories per gram, you can look at fat compared to something like carbohydrate, which is 4 calories per gram, and think that like per weight, yeah, it's an efficient way to get calories in. It has over double the amount of calories. But even the leanest athlete already has plenty of fat stored in their body that their body will use to fuel exercise. So there's not really a reason to take in more fat. We actually store fat in our muscles. They're called intramuscular triglycerides. And it's been shown that really high performing athletes have really high fat stores in their muscles that they can then use to generate energy via aerobic metabolism when they're exercising. Fats are also slower to digest than carbohydrates. And if you consume fats with carbohydrates, they actually slow the digestion and the absorption of carbohydrates. So they can have a negative impact on your body's ability to access that energy quickly. Fats also, because they don't have, fatty acids don't have oxygen in them, unlike carbohydrates, they actually require more oxygen to make ATP. So fats per unit make more ATP, but it's not as efficiently made. They're also not helpful at higher intensities. We already talked about that. Carbohydrates can only be used anaerobically, not fats. And for longer efforts, I think they're fine to include some, but they shouldn't be your primary fuel source. And you should also really think about where you're using them and whether or not they're impacting the absorption of those carbohydrates you need to get into your body. So let's talk a little bit about pre-race nutrition. So we kind of did the science in the background, and let's feed that into what you should actually eat or consider eating before your race or your run. So I kind of break this up into 2 different meals. Sometimes this 2 to 3 hour before start time meal is just not possible. You have, a 6 a.m. start time. Sometimes it's even earlier than that. I don't think that you should set your alarm and wake up 2 to 3 hours in advance. If you're able to sleep the night before your race, I was never able to sleep the night before any of the ultras that I did, but if you are able to, stay asleep. Sleep can be a really important thing as well. if you're up, you might consider trying to have something 2 to 3 hours ahead of time. But the goal of this meal should really be to restock glycogen, which goes down after your overnight fast. So your liver glycogen levels really go down. And if you remember, your liver glycogen is what's responsible for boosting that blood glucose. It's also really important to hydrate at this point. So this meal should be mostly carbohydrates, a little bit of protein. So what the protein is important for is high quality proteins have branched chain amino acids in them, which are a subclass of essential amino acids that actually help both kickstart muscle protein synthesis, but research has shown that having them in your system while you're exercising helps with recovery and soreness after. So they've shown that if you have BCAAs in your system, then the delayed onset muscle soreness, or that 2 to 3 day after can't walk down the stairs feeling you have, is reduced. So getting some protein in at this time is a great idea. This meal should be about 75 to 100 grams of carbs, 304 to 400 calories. That's obviously going to fluctuate based on body size. So that's just an average. Try to avoid too much fat and fiber. So both fat and fiber are slower to digest. And so it's going to impact your body's ability to get all those nutrients or the energy from the carbohydrates. So it doesn't mean you have to totally nix fat and fiber, just don't make them the primary, macro in this meal. And then start pre-hydrating with water and electrolytes at about 12 to 24 ounces. So then this next meal, which is much more reasonable for most of us that have early morning races, should be about 60 minutes before start time. And this meal should really be about topping off blood glucose and hydrating. So 25 to 30 grams of simple carbs, that's about 100 to 120 calories. And the emphasis here is on simple carbohydrates. This is when you want those high glycemic index carbs that your body's going to absorb quickly. Water and electrolytes also, even if you've had 12 to 24 ounces 2 to 3 hours beforehand, continue hydrating if you can. It's better to start off hydrated than dehydrated. And this would be a place to consider a branched chain amino acid supplement. I already mentioned in the previous slide the impact that it can have on recovery by having these amino acids at higher levels in your body. So I'm going to turn it over to Trevor now, and he can talk a little bit maybe about what he does for pre-race nutrition.
Yeah, it's funny, Shannon. I think I read an article in Runner's World like 100 years ago that you should always wake up 3 hours early to eat breakfast before a race. So I think I've done it ever since. But that is normally what I do. And I think you pretty much nailed exactly what I try to do. In the past, I've messed around with like granola and oatmeal and things like that. And what I found is they tend to have a little too much fiber, and that turns into problems later on. So what I've done and had the most success with is usually a bagel or a bagel and a half with some nut butter. Pretty simple, maybe like some maple syrup or honey or something on there to sweeten it and just get some extra carbs. Usually a cup of coffee. Pretty simple, pretty basic. Try to keep it sort of bland and basic so it's not hurting my stomach later. And then usually, on the drive to the start line or whatever, I'll take a gel or whatever I'm using to fuel for that day. If it's like a electrolyte drink or something like that, then I'll take a little bit of that beforehand. But usually I eat enough in the 2 to 3 hours before that I'm pretty good to go before I start. So that's kind of been the gold standard for me, though. Bagels and nut butter.
I think it's a good call. And I think the carbohydrates good also, beyond just like helping us wake up a little bit, it gets things moving in the morning, which can be good before your race.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Trevor. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now I'm going to go to during run nutrition. So what do I eat while I'm running? I'm going to break this into two pieces. So hydration guidelines and nutritional strategies. And after each, Trevor will jump in and talk a little bit about what he does. So hydration can really be broken down into two pieces. So how much fluid do you need to replace? And the easiest way to kind of get an idea of where you should be on this is to do a sweat test. So the fluid you need to replace is really informed by the amount that you sweat, so the amount of fluid that you're losing when you're exercising. And things like effort, temperature, humidity, clothing type, fluid status can all affect sweat rate. And so doing a sweat test basically allows you to see how much in a particular environment, wearing a particular type of clothing at a certain time of year, you sweat. So I brought all of those things in because if you live, you know, in, let's say, the Southeast, and you're racing in Arizona in March, obviously the factors like temperature and humidity and the clothing you're going to wear when you're running in one place or the other are going to change. And so your sweat rate might change. So it could be, you know, the results of something like this test are going to be most valid when you do them in the environment and you try to as closely match these factors to the environment that you're racing as possible. So you might have to do this more than one time. But it's just something good to do if you've never done it. The way you do a sweat test, super simple. Weigh yourself before running naked. You don't want to have clothes on that are going to impact the weight and then potentially be sweaty later on. So it's best to do it without any clothes on when you weigh yourself. Then put your clothes back on. You don't want to go for an hour run without anything on. Notice how many ounces of fluid you drink. So pay attention. You might not drink any, and that's totally fine. But if you do drink some water, make sure you know how much water you drink. Then weigh yourself after running again, once again naked, so that any sweat taken up by your clothes doesn't impact the weight. So you're then going to subtract your post-run weight from your pre-run weight. And when you do this, 1 pound lost equals 16 ounces of water. So you're going to add the ounces lost in sweat to the ounces consumed. So if you drank any water, let's say, we're going to go through an example in a minute, but let's say you drank 4 ounces, you would add that to the amount you lost to get the approximate amount of fluid ounces per hour you should be drinking. So as an example, let's say your pre-run weight was 130 pounds. And during that hour, you consumed 8 ounces of water. And your post-run weight was 129 pounds. So you lost 1 pound of water weight, which was 16 ounces of water. And then you're going to add the 8 ounces that you consumed. So you should be consuming 24 ounces per hour about. Ideally, most research suggests you shouldn't hit this number right on. You should aim for about 80 to 90% of this number. So it just gives you a ballpark idea of what you should aim for to stay hydrated given the amount of sweat that you're losing on a regular basis. So the second part of the hydration question is electrolytes. So if you drink too much water, you can get into a situation where hyponatremia becomes a concern. You're diluting your body's electrolytes, which can be a serious health factor. So you want to make sure, especially, might not be as important on shorter runs, but when you're running for longer periods, you're losing a ton of sodium in your sweat and you need to replace that sodium. So you do lose other electrolytes like magnesium and chloride and calcium, but to much smaller extents. Really what we need to focus on is replacing that sodium. So the amount of sodium in sweat averages about 500 milligrams of sodium per pound of sweat. So that was that 16 ounces we talked about in the previous slide. And it can range, so there's a huge range from people. It can range from 220 milligrams in that pound up to 1,100 milligrams. And I think there are companies now where you can send samples of your sweat and they can measure this for you. But there are definitely factors that dictate how much sweat you can lose, and things like genetics, how much sodium you actually include in your diet. If you have a higher sodium diet, you're going to lose more sodium in your sweat. Temperature, humidity, and acclimatization can also impact how much sodium you lose. So as a general recommendation, start with about 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium per hour. And this can be through fluids, so through an electrolyte replacement, and also through foods. So now I'm going to turn it over to Trevor. I don't know if you've ever done a sweat rate test, Trevor. You just kind of figured out through trial and error how much you drink, but what do you try to get in terms of hydration and electrolytes?
Yeah, I should probably do that because if I'm being totally honest, this is probably a place where I really struggle sometimes is making sure that I stay fully hydrated.
Well, especially because you love to race in Hawaii, going from Utah to
Yeah,
Hawaii is going to be
on
hard.
it, I think that sometimes I have better luck there because there it's just so hot and humid that I know I need to drink all the time. So
Yeah.
I'm just taking a sip every minute or so. Sometimes it's in the drier climates and a little bit cooler races that I really have a challenge getting enough hydration because I'm not scientific about it. And I think I slept through most of my math classes in high school. So like trying to do math on the run is not my thing. But I think I usually try to drink about 16 to 20 ounces an hour, and that's always seemed to work well for me when I can do that. Sometimes it's hard if I'm like super focused and I put my head down, I'm really grinding something out, I'll forget to do it. And so something I've done in the past is just sort of like set an alarm on my watch or set a timer at least every 30 minutes or so, just to remind myself that I need to drink in case I have stopped at some point. And then I also set goals. If I usually know what roughly my splits are going to be between aid stations. So if I have 6 or 7 miles between an aid station, I'll have 24 ounces of water, we'll say, and I know that I'm going to drink all 24 ounces before I get into the next aid station. It usually helps with me because if my wife's crewing me, she gets really mad at me if I still have water in my bottles when I get there. So it's a good motivating factor to empty them out, or at least dump them on my head if I'm.
What about electrolytes? Do you have goals around those too? Like how much sodium you're trying to take in?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I've ever been too specific about it. I just know that I need to try to replenish the sodium as I go. So that's one nice thing, and we'll get to it when we start talking about the Fuel 2.0. But I feel like that's super dialed on the sodium, and I'll talk a little more about the product and the success I've had with that. But yeah, so I think having a electrolyte drink that has just dialed the amount of sodium that you need as a person helps if you're drinking that as your main source.
100%.
So, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Gnarly Hydrate, which is going to be at Aravaipa races that are less than a marathon. So Gnarly Hydrate has 250 milligrams of sodium per serving, which is about a 12-ounce serving. So if you were trying to consume 24 ounces, 20 to 24 ounces, it would get you up to that high 400s, 500 milligram per sodium per hour. It also has magnesium, potassium, calcium, and chloride to much smaller extents, as I mentioned before. What we're really trying to replace when we are replacing electrolytes lost through sweat is the sodium. It has B vitamins in it, which are important for energy metabolism in athletes, and research has shown athletes can be chronically low in B vitamins. Has some sugar for effective hydration. So water is actually pushed passively from your gut into your body, but it's also pushed actively via something called the sodium glucose pump. And so having some sugar helps with that active transport of water, but it doesn't really have enough sugar, one, to cause gut rot, or enough sugar to be your primary calorie source. So it's really just about hydration, about getting water and electrolytes in your body. And for that reason, it's really easy to drink. I'll talk about Gnarly Fuel 2.0 in a minute, but I'm going to dive into some nutrition recommendations, and we can talk to Trevor. I'll introduce Fuel 2.0 after this slide, and we can talk to Trevor about what he does for fueling and his experience with Fuel 2.0. So I kind of have divided this up into 2 time segments because it really depends on the distance that you're running, how important and really strict about fueling you have to be. So with runs that are 90 minutes or less, if you remember, we had talked earlier about your body having enough glycogen when your glycogen stores are full to fuel runs of 60 to 90 minutes. So that can depend on the person, and once again, how full those glycogen stores are. If you're starting the run depleted because of an overnight fast, you might not make it to that 90 minutes. And so that might be where some light fueling comes into play. But if you're only running for 60 minutes, you might not necessarily need to take in food. Also at this point, you should really just use thirst as an indicator of when to drink. You're probably not sweating enough where you're going to get into, a risk of a dehydrated status in 90 minutes. You're also not losing enough electrolytes, but really when you get to 90 minutes or longer, that's when you really need to pay attention. So I would gauge your intensity and where you're running and really have that inform whether or not you need to be a little bit more strict about hydration and electrolyte replacement as you get closer to the 90-minute mark. For runs that are over 90 minutes, this is where taking in carbohydrates as an external fuel source becomes important. And this should really start as soon as you run. If you know you're going to be running, you don't want to wait to deplete your glycogen sources before you start fueling. So you should start as soon as possible, just keeping those blood glucose levels high so that your body can also use that as energy and not bring your stored glycogen to zero. Generally, the amount of food that you can take in is very individual to each person. Some people are able to take in a huge amount of food. Some people may not need or are only able to take in smaller amounts. Part of that is dependent upon how much your body uses fat as a fuel, and part of it is just dependent upon the individual. But usually 160 to 300 calories per hour is a good range to shoot in. There's kind of a set point beyond 400 calories where most people aren't able to take in more food or more carbohydrate than that on an hourly basis. So I usually recommend people start in that range and then see how much they can tolerate and slowly start inching it up if they need to. But that equates to about 40 to 75 grams of simple carbohydrates per hour. And I've seen athletes actually make packets that have like a set amount of calories in them and have their crew or have them in their aid station packs. So they don't really have to think about it. And by pre-packing calories in a bag, it just kind of takes the math out of it. As Trevor was saying, not doing math on the run, you're getting in the calories you need, and you've practiced on your longer runs, and that your body tolerates that many calories and that it sustains you for the long term. Also, just to bring that hydrate piece back into it. So on these longer runs, you want to aim for 89 to 90% of your sweat rate results or what you've worked out through your training. Similar to Trevor, you need to replace, and shoot for 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium per hour. Trevor actually already mentioned this relative to hydrating, and I've seen more and more people talk about this, and I think it's a great tip is to set your watch timer for a regular interval, like 15 or 20 minutes, as a reminder to eat and drink. And what we're talking about here is not what you just do on a race day, right? You shouldn't do anything new on a race day, and that includes your nutrition. It should be something that you practice and train for throughout the preparation for the race. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Gnarly Fuel 2.0, which is a new product that we're actually not releasing until May. I wish we had it for people to try now, but it will be at races starting this weekend. And then we'll have it to sell to customers on the retail front starting in May. So Gnarly Fuel 2.0 is calories, electrolytes, and then a BCA metabolite all in one. So it's 100 calories per 12 ounces from easy to digest carbs, glucose and sucrose. Both glucose and sucrose are easily absorbed. They're absorbed through two different two different carbohydrate transporters in your body. So they're unlikely when you use both of those to cause gut rot, and the percentage of carbohydrate in this solution is also unlikely to cause gut rot. along with those 100 calories per 12 ounces is 250 milligrams of sodium per 12 ounces. So most people will look at consuming for longer races 2 servings per hour, depending on how much you like to use food versus fluid calories. And at 2 servings, you would get 200 calories in 24 ounces and 500 milligrams of sodium in 24 ounces. So getting much closer to those recommendations for electrolytes and carbohydrates that I talked about previously. Also has magnesium, potassium, calcium, and chloride to a smaller extent, and has a BCAA metabolite called HMB to promote recovery. So as we talked about, keeping BCAAs high in your body while you're exercising actually helps with recovery and soreness afterwards. So by including this BCAA metabolite in Fuel 2.0, you're consistently, if you're using this throughout your race, keeping those BCAA levels where they need to be to help you recover faster. And Trevor was pretty much my guinea pig for formulating this product, and he's used it in a few races. So I'm going to let him kind of talk about Fuel 2.0 and also talk about maybe some other things he does for nutrition during his races.
Yeah. So I aim for around 200 calories per hour. That's kind of been my gold standard, I think. And yeah, it was really nice to be the guinea pig on this product. I used it for Hurt 100 earlier in 2020 in January, and then I used it again for White Rim in November. I did pretty well at both of those events, and I ran a couple things in the summer where I did not use the Fuel 2.0, and I bombed those events super hard. So if there's any correlation there. What I like about this stuff, though, is it has, for me, it just seemed to have the right amount of sodium and calories, perfect combination. So if I'm just sipping on this as I run, taking, a few ounces at a time, I stayed hydrated, and I never had a low spot in any of those events. And I can't say that I've ever run another 100-mile event where I've never had a low point until I started using this product. So to me, it's been a total game changer. And I don't think I could ever try to run another event that I was serious about doing well at without using this, because I'm very, very confident that it's the best fueling product on the market right now. So as far as other things,
I've never heard that kind of talk about it that way, and that makes me super excited.
Well,
yeah.
I'm being very sincere, because it's good stuff, and it tastes great too. Another thing I do, though, is I just to satiate any hunger I may have, I'll usually carry like a Cliff Bar or something like that, something I can chew on, maybe eat half a bar every once in a while, every few hours, just to kind of my stomach starts grumbling, keep that down. And usually at aid stations, I'll nibble on some fruit or some potato chips if I'm craving something salty, and almost always have a little bit of Coke. Just a good pick me up every time I get in, and kind of makes me feel alive again. So that's usually what I do. And honestly, I've always kind of been my racing plan. I've always felt no plan is the best plan. And for me, that's because I feel like in longer events, especially 100 miles, so many times things start to go out the window after, 40 or 50 miles. And, your stomach can start to turn, and it's hard to get food down. Sometimes it's better just to wing it and be adaptable and try to eat different things. And that's why when I do my long runs on weekends and stuff, I always practice with different foods, eat things like pancakes that I carry with me and stuff, just to like try to train my gut to be able to eat anything. That way, if nothing's working during the middle of a race, I can kind of just go by whatever sounds good, because generally, if it sounds good to you and is appetizing, it's probably going to go down and sit well. But I will say, once I started using the Fuel 2.0, I haven't really had to rely on the no plan so much as well. It's gone really well, and I've been able to execute my nutrition and hydration better than I ever have before. So
awesome. That's a good little piece to think about. And I'm glad you said it, to learn how to be a little more flexible too when what you might have in your pack isn't working. Yeah, that's good advice. Speaking of Coke, this was actually me after the Bryce 50. So Coke plays an important role in my run nutrition too. So post-run nutrition, I have this window of 30 minutes to 2 hours. You know, you always hear people talking about this golden hour. You really need to get carbs and protein in, you know, in this hour to really recover right. And it is important to try to get it in as soon as possible, but it's not like your recovery is shot if you don't get it in within an hour. So, you know, as long as you get it in, I think even if it's 2 hours out, it's better than nothing. And the goal of this is really to replenish glycogen stores and to kickstart muscle repair and synthesis, and then also to hydrate or get back into a hydrated status. So this meal should be in a ratio of 1-3 or 1-4 protein to simple carbs. So that could look like 15 to 20 grams of protein and about 60 to 80 grams of carbs. That amount of protein, trying to get as close as you can to 20 grams, is key, just because of the proportion of essential and branched chain amino acids that you're going to get in that quantity of protein. That's really optimizing muscle protein synthesis, which is going to help with the repair of muscle that was broken down during your race. Also want to have 16 to 18 ounces of electrolytes I've written here, but basically an electrolyte replacement drink. You can combine all these together, get it in a smoothie. You can have it in a meal and have your electrolytes on the side, whatever works for you and whatever you have time for. Plan ahead if you're, you know, out doing your own adventure run, or if you're out training, and try to have, you know, supplements in the car, or food in the car in a cooler, so you don't have to wait, you know, till you get home to have a meal like this. And this is especially important if you're doing 2-a-day training, because you're going to need to recover well for that second session, and back-to-back long runs, it becomes particularly important. So something to focus on. Trevor, what do you do post-run?
Yeah, I pretty much do exactly what you just said. My standard is that I will do 2 scoops of gnarly vegan protein in a blender bottle and eat a banana. If I'm out and about, if I'm home, I'll make a smoothie with that. I'll throw in some ice cubes and a little bit of salt, maybe some maple syrup or something like that. And that's generally what I try to do as soon as I walk in the door when I get done with the good run. And then try to hit a meal like, you know, within an hour and a half, 2 hours after a run.
Yeah. So. Awesome. Great. Well, that is pretty much all I had to present. I would love if you guys have questions for me, or more importantly, questions for Trevor. We're happy to take them now. And thanks so much for letting us talk to you about run nutrition.
Thanks so much to both of you, Shannon and Trevor. This was just a great recap. Well, first for my college biology class there, so thanks for that. I feel like I forgot all of that information, but a really simple way to understand the importance of all the factors going into pre, during, and post-race nutrition. I've never won the HURT 100, but I can say, specific to my own experience in Arizona, I think that liquid nutrition has played a really important part in my running here, just because the heat really causes your stomach to turn, and it is impossible sometimes to keep down like physical food. So having the ability to have liquid nutrition has really been a game changer for me moving out here. So we're super excited to be able to have that available now at all of our races.
Awesome. Yeah, and I should say the Gnarly Fuel 2.0, I think the flavor that you guys have for this race is the limeade. We'll also have a tropical flavor, and then we'll have a caffeinated cherry cola flavor as well. So look for all 3 of those flavors when we launch the product in May.
I think the one that you sent us to try was a guava flavor. Is that right?
Tropical, yeah.
Yeah, that was really delicious too.
Good.
I'll have to try the limeade before it goes out to Mesquite this weekend.
Yeah, it's good. They're all really light. And I just think easy to drink. And that was kind of the goal. Is I think probably most people have had an experience with flavor fatigue when you have something that's super sweet that you just get sick of it, and you're like, it's the last thing I want, you know. And we didn't want people to have that experience with this product. So we tried to make it pretty light.
Absolutely.
I've used it for 100 miles and never got sick of it. So
That's saying a lot.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, were there any questions at all? And we got a couple people on here. Nope. Well, you just answered everything, Shannon.
Awesome.
It's just so comprehensive. So, all right. Well, thank you to both of you. Really appreciate it. We'll have this recorded so we can have it available for all of our runners and hopefully get some more people tuning in for the recording.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Julie.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
See you guys. Have a
Bye.
good race this weekend.
Wiley says thanks as well.
Yeah. Thanks for attending, Wiley. Okay, take care. Have a good night, guys.
You too.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.